Hello, we are in another episode of Diálogos, and now we have Terry Anderson. And Terry Anderson is a professor emeritus of economics at Montana State University and senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. So, Terry, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. It's a beautiful summer day. We don't get very early summer in Montana. Had snow on the mountains just 2 days ago, so uh,
well,
a beautiful day.
here in Argentina we are reaching winter time, but at the same time we have like a spring day. So maybe we can call it that we have all set. You have let's call that we are in the same spring area. Let's go
Yeah,
with
yeah,
that. Um.
that's great.
Okay, but
Well, I love your country, by the way. I've visited only once and can't wait for one more visit before I stop visiting places. But Argentina is a wonderful country.
well, Argentina has many issues, and I think that in your work you may describe some solutions. For example, in your renowned work in the not so Wild West, many of the institutional arrangements you describe operated in relatively small and localized communities. But what do you see as the main obstacle to scaling these forms of governance to larger and more complex societies? Which I think it's the point that I can't, I can see fitting.
I think the two words I would focus on from what you just said are larger and the uh, uh, complexity that comes with scale. So let me just start with scale because I think it's extremely important and too often ignored in the way institutions are viewed. Scale, and I want to think both in terms of geographic scale and human numbers, population scale. Uh, in small groups where we know one another, we see one another's face, we share a history that brings customs to us that allow us to interact, including language, then forming the institutions that create a civil society is much easier. As we scale up in population to more people, then the likelihood that we will have ever interacted, that we will share all of the past cultures, it gets lower and lower, and it therefore scaling up is much more difficult. Let me just emphasize right now that most recently I've don't tell my fellow economists I said this, but I've started questioning the notion that a willing buyer, willing seller is what matters in economic transactions. And the reason I'm questioning it is I might buy your house and move into it, but your neighbors will look at me and say, "But you don't speak my language. You don't have the right accent. You don't share the customs that we're all used to sharing." And those customs don't get exchanged in markets. And I think that as a result, this goes back to the question of how much you can scale up institutions. As we scale upward in terms of the people involved, we lose those customs that are really important, I think, for reducing transaction costs. And then let me just emphasize the complexity part. The complexity that's involved when it's more than just you and I sharing a property boundary and you graze cows and I graze cows. That's not very complex. We both understand what we're doing. But if you're raising cows and I'm building a factory that is noisy and smoky, that kind of complexity is much harder to deal with across that fence between us. So scaling up is crucial to capturing the gains from trade that exist when we specialize in the goods we produce and exchange. But it's not easy to scale up when we don't have shared values, we don't have shared customs, and we don't have shared institutions for enforcing the gains from trade.
Does that include enforcement or the group of enforcement, like police, like defense, for example, in terms of, okay, we have well, the service of policemen is public, is state owned. Okay, I get it. But in a complex societies with many populations, is it possible to have like private justice owners, or it can be only like an externality, and it has to be like state owned?
Well, let me start with the smallest. Again, your property on one side of the fence and mine on the other. My neighbor recently said to me, "Do you know that your dog was barking in the middle of the night?" And I didn't know that. And he was, in a sense, telling me that my dog's noise was bothering him, infringing on his ears. And we solved that problem right away. My dog is locked up every night. He will not be out barking in the middle of the night. We don't need a police force any bigger than just across our fence, shaking hands and following customs. You just be nice to one another. As you go beyond that, we live in a subdivision which has what's called a homeowners association. And it has lots of different rules about what your house can look like, about how many houses you can build. And those, again, are pretty much enforced within the association. They are a contract that would be enforced by the state if it pushed that far. And so as we keep scaling up, so the street past my house has lots of motorcycles that go down it, and there's a big curve. They love to speed around, and they are noisy. Well, I called the sheriff and said, "Sheriff, I don't like this noise." But it's very difficult even for the sheriff to stand out on that street 24 hours a day and tell them to keep quiet. So it takes something like a sheriff to solve that kind of a problem. And then let me just leap to the national defense. If we're talking about one country defending itself against invasions from another country, and I won't go on and on about that today, there's too much of that. But national defense is something that requires a much larger state, and it's in between all of these examples from my neighbors saying my dog is barking to motorcycles to national defense. There's a limit for how much collective action we need. I don't think we need too much for the barking dog. We need maybe a little more for street rules and a lot more scale for national defense.
Yes, because actually my next question was going into that direction. If we consider that repeated interactions or customs are evolving in a imperfect in a not perfect way, but they are evolving and people get to know each other. Okay, but as population grow, social relations become more anonymous, like in a big city. So how would you answer to this challenge?
The way I think about it is starting to think small, and that's what the book The Not So Wild Wild West is about. It was about a frontier where there weren't that many people. There were different people. There were Native Americans, and there were British, and there were Scottish, and there were Spanish, and they all had different customs, different languages, and so on. So it wasn't an easy place for institutions to evolve. But given that the numbers were small and the interaction, personal interaction, was much greater, in fact, without it, you probably would have a hard time surviving on that frontier without a supermarket to buy your food and a neighbor to help you build a fence or whatever. In those cases, we start small, and I think that you emphasize the evolutionary part of it. The small group then interacts with another small group, and they either end up fighting, or they end up coming to some agreement about how they will share customs and property rights and law, and that can continue to grow. The larger it gets, the higher the transaction costs of that interaction, because the less we know one another's customs, the less we know about backgrounds, and the less we know about the technology that each person brings to the evolutionary process. So someone who's, in fact, let me use the not so wild West. Cattle ranching and sheep ranching came into conflict with one another. The sheep were in small bands herded by an individual. The cattle roamed all over. They weren't in small bands. And who got to graze where and when became a big conflict. And again, so I just emphasize there that technology matters too.
What actually bugs my mind, and it's something that it's my next question, but now that you mentioned frontiers and all of that, is that considering that that Hayekian point of view, that we evolve in an imperfect way, we learn by trial and error, yes, and that it's okay, but it seems like in some part of world history, state was, and I put some, I put some caution when I'm saying this, necessary. I'm following here Charles Tilly. He said that state made war and war made state, and this is something that if you think about it, it's kind of logical. Because United States had war, even civil wars, and so do you think that as you studied frontiers, but in a larger scale, is this can be avoided to be controlled from a centralized authority that eventually will become necessary, as I mentioned before? Like, the state seems like a necessary thing in history. I'm not talking about metaphysics here. I'm just talking about historical facts. So only that.
Well, I've not heard that quotation before, as
Okay.
the state makes war, but war makes states. I'm going to ponder that much more, because when you said it, I immediately was trying to say which came first, and it's not.
That's
You
the
can't
thing.
say. You can't
That's the
say
thing
which came first.
that bugs my mind. Yes, what came first? Yeah.
So I think rather than ask which came first, I think it's better to focus on, does the state make war, or does it prevent war? And thought of in that way, let me put it in the context of an area that I've done more study of and writing of than almost more than the not so wild West, though it's part of it. And that is the interaction between the colonizing countries, England, Spain, Portugal, and the native Americans in our case. And the early on in those interfaces, the British were very quick to forge contracts, if you will, but to forge treaties with the Native Americans, recognizing that they had a right to the land, and that they would trade with them, and they would recognize both property rights to housing, to places to hunt, to places to fish, to land on which you might grow crops, and they agreed with one another that those were the property rights, and the state, if you will, that the British brought with them, to stick with the British example, was part of bargaining with the less smaller states, but still with governments that were the Native American governments. So that's a case where I think the state prevented war. It was a necessary part of allowing two very different societies to interface with one another and come to agreements. Well, why would there have been why was there such a willingness to agree on the part of the British? Well, the Native Americans were well armed. They had bows and arrows, but they could fling arrows faster than you could possibly load a musket and fire at them. And they knew the country. They had the advantage in warfare. Furthermore, if you wanted to fight the Indians, you did it. You didn't have an army. You had to go out with your sons and daughters and wives and neighbors and fight. And so it was made much more sense to settle with negotiation. Now, fast forward to following the Civil War in the United States, the U.S. government established a standing army paid for by the federal government. That meant that the people in Massachusetts paid taxes, and the people in Nebraska maybe had the cavalry out there to fight the Indians. Well, that changes the calculus for whether you raid or trade, as Fred McChesney and I put it in an article we wrote. Once you're not facing all the costs, it's much easier to say, well, let's send the army out to take, and then we're to the other side of the state. The state makes war, and Fred McChesney and I document, I think, quite well that it was the rise of the standing army that led to the state making war. And today, of course, countries have standing armies, and as a result, they make more wars than they stop, I think.
But the point that I'm making here, and following what Charles Tilly, or Tilly, because it's like a French surname, but he states that every empire, every single country, and even think in Argentina, for the state capabilities, there were always war. There was like an army, and for that army you needed taxes, you needed water, you needed food, so you had resources. And then when you had the land, when you had the property, then you build the state, then you build the capabilities. And that is the history of Argentina. The native and the criollos, the people, the people that made the revolution against the Spaniards. Well, it was war, and yes, the Indians lost. So we had a stable coin, one single coin, currency. Sorry, limits, the state separated from church. So you see that these capabilities are like a product from war, and I'm following Charles Tilly reasoning here.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, once the state has the power, no, not once it has, the state is defined as a collection of people who have the ability and power to coerce other people. And the founding fathers in the U.S. were very concerned about the tyranny of the majority. If a majority of the people, 51%, could coerce the other 49%, then you really end up with civil war very often. And to establish first just very formal rules for preventing that sort of tyranny, is not easy. Today, we revere democracy as the way to stop that tyranny from occurring. But if by a democracy you mean 51% of the people vote to take from 49%, that's not a very good democracy. So you need other kinds of rules that limit the ability of the state. But then the question becomes, well, who enforces those? If the state enforces the rules against the state, it's very problematic. And that takes me back to what I'm more and more convinced of, and that is the role that customs play, that our notion of what's right and what's wrong. So we say, thou shalt not kill. Now, yeah, if I kill you, and your family takes this matter up with the state is going to find out what happened, and if I'm guilty, prosecute me. But the question of thou shalt not kill is not so much governed by the state's ability to hang me. It's because I'm told from the time I'm a little kid, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. And those are a couple of fundamental points that I think add to the limit of the state. And once those disappear, once you have a set of customs, and I'm more convinced that a lot of this comes from organized religion, the Ten Commandments in the Christian context, that those rules are part of what underpin a limited state, and without them, that it's much more difficult to keep tyranny from occurring. And this comes back to complexity then. If I'm Christian and you're Muslim, if I'm Buddhist and you're an atheist, it's much harder for us to interact with one another because we don't have those fundamental rules that are this is right and that is wrong.
Well, I highly recommend the book by the evolutionary anthropologist that actually received the high prize, Joseph Henrich, The Weirdest People in the World. Weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, and we are an anomaly. Not all of the world is like that. And he tested. So this is a point for customary law, for how customs work. But
I thank you for reminding me of that. I've forgotten that book. I have it on my bookshelf. I'm going, after we're finished, I'm going to pull it back off because it really is an important part of what I'm saying about customs.
Yeah, and I have to say that book changed my mind. You know, that book is Hayek but tested in a biological way, let's say. And even though that Hayek knew a lot about biology, but continuing that, there's a point that some scholars argue that successful cases of self-governance are subject to let's say to selection bias. Like, we tend to study the communities that survived, while we overlook those that failed. So how would researchers evaluate the frontier experience while accounting for institutional failures and not only the successful cases?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's obvious. It's much harder to study the failures because they don't leave much of a footprint. They don't leave much of a record. I'm reminded of the joke about economists, and the economist lost his one economist lost his contact lens, and another economist came along and said, "Why are you down on the ground?" And the economist on the ground says, "Well, I lost my contact lens and I'm looking for it." And the other one says, "Well, where did you lose it?" And he said, "Oh, across the street." And so the one on the ground is asked, "Well, why are you looking here?" And he said, "Because the light is better." Well, that's where we look for things, where the light is better, and those are the surviving institutions. Uh, but there are good examples of institutions that fail, maybe because they didn't have all the characteristics that we've been talking about customs and backgrounds and informal rules that we live by. But they fail because technology changes, for example. And when technology changes, the institutions that were formed, in the case of the American West, the cattlemen's associations were people who rode out there on the open range and made sure the cattle that were out there belonged to you because they had your brand on them. But then once we got barbed wire, that all changed. And Charlie Russell, one of the famous painters from Montana, has a wonderful painting called The End of the Cowboy. And it's a picture of a cowboy with a fence in the background. And his job was gone. And so the institutions that were there without barbed wire are very different than the ones you get with barbed wire. So I think we can find institutions that fail for those kinds of reasons, and we can learn a great deal from them. What was so inflexible about the rules before barbed wire, and how do those rules work today? So I like to find institutions that fail because they are a good teacher as well.
I had my mic off. But this is something that actually that always again like bugs my mind. The emergence of cities throughout history, and in Argentina basically most, because we have a big territory, not as big as the United States of course, but there are like government owned land, and there are immigrants, inner immigrants, and immigrants from other countries coming. So there are the emergence of cities. So many seem to have begun through spontaneous processes, but eventually they develop like formal government, bureaucracies, and so. So do you view this evolution as evidence of the limits of spontaneous institutions, or simply as one path among many?
Well, definitely, I think it's one path among many because if you look at American Indians, Native Americans, there were some cities in North America that were much larger than cities in Europe at the time of colonization. They were formed, and then farther south towards you, the Aztec, the Incas. They had large cities that worked, and that evolutionary process. I don't pretend to understand it totally, but it was a case of economies of scale, bringing people together who could work. You could work better at growing corn, and I could work better at digging a ditch to deliver water. So cities have that evolutionary tendency, often driven mostly by technology, but they do evolve in civilized ways. I always think of my grandfather who migrated from Serbia and came to a small coal mining town in Montana. And in that town, there were little areas of the small town where the Serbians lived, and they spoke Serbian. They also could speak a little English. Across the way were Italians, and across the way from them were the Spanish, and the list goes on. And while they, in some sense, shared very few customs, certainly didn't share language, they evolved in a way to begin to use, say, the English language as a way to overcome these borders between them and make a much larger community. And I think that's just an evolutionary process. That said, as you grow the numbers, then the scale increases, and as the scale increases, I think the transaction costs of that interaction go up, and I'm not. I think that as we witness cities around the world where chaos seems to prevail at times, recently in New York City, just because their team won the basketball championship, there was a great deal of violence. Now, it seems just incomprehensible to me as to why that would happen, but it did happen, and I think it's partly because in such large masses of people, it's hard to find the institutions that allow them to interact civilly.
Yeah, yes, and that's curious because it's always like the perspective that in Argentina, like it plays the Super Clásico, Boca Juniors against River Plate. Okay, so there's going to be a riot. It's going to be like something is going to be destroyed, and they say, okay, here are the monkeys that are playing in Boca Juniors. They are like chimpanzees, but if we go north, if we go to a successful country like United States, we have to admit that it happens the same. So it's like we need the state or we need police to control this horrible things that happens.
But we don't. We certainly need the police. We do. There's no question that government does have coercive power, and that coercive power, as you pointed out earlier, can either be used to start wars or stop wars, and it's used to prevent you from stealing my property, even though it's not right to steal. You might still try to do it because you're hungry or whatever reason. So we need the police power for that, but it doesn't mean that the police power is unlimited, and police power alone won't overcome the kind of violence that we're talking about in these crazy times when a sports team sparks the violence. So the point is just, yes, that you have to have the police. I'm not an anarcho-capitalist who thinks we can all just live out here in the wilds of Montana and somehow get along because we each carry 6 guns. But if we each carry a 6 gun on our hip and that's all we have, and we're equally able to use it, then maybe we don't need a police force in that context. There's a very good article. Now I've forgotten the author, but I'll maybe come back to that. But about how rules evolved in mining camps in a very civil way when the people had 6 guns and everybody knew how to use that gun they carried, and everybody was pretty much equally proficient in the use of that, and they all had roughly the same goal of mining gold in these gold camps, and they all used the basic same technology to do it. And in those cases, you had so much homogeneity that it evolved without a police force per se. On the other hand, if one person gets really good with the gun and can shoot everybody else, then that may be the start of a state that we don't really want.
And that leads me to the final question, but again, the emergence of cities is something that really bugs my mind. There is a peripheral area in Argentina. It's named Cuartel Quinto. It will be like Cuartel 5. It's really poor, but it's mainly state owned. But inner immigrants and foreign immigrants took over. They didn't pay anything, took over, and just built. Do you agree with the homestead principle, or do you not?
Well, let me distinguish between the homestead principle as I think you mean it and as it pops into the mind of any student of American history. homesteading in the United States is thought of as a government-controlled way of allocating land, where the government said, you can go out and live in Montana and you can claim this many acres, and they'll be in a square because we have a rectangular survey. And if you stay there for long enough and you build a cabin on it and you plant a crop, then you own that land. That's one kind of homesteading. Another kind of homesteading is, I think, what you're really asking about, and that is I look out there in the world that John Locke saw it and said, well, there's empty space over there. It's not being used. I think I'll go homestead on that. That is, set down my house and my production and live on that land. And then I claim it because I have mixed my labor with the land. That kind of homesteading is sounds very bucolic, isn't that a wonderful agrarian kind of life? And it works fine as long as there's open land to be homesteaded. But as population grows, then the amount of open land starts to decrease, and eventually there will be conflicts over those boundaries. And we're back to, do we need a state to resolve that conflict over the boundary between your land and my land? Or do we need a state only when the conflicts grow so big that you form your army and I form mine, and we fight with one another because we don't like our skin color, or we don't like the language we speak, or whatever other reasons we have for the fight?
Well,
and therein is the question of, how do you limit the state from getting that big?
yeah, the thing is that maybe those new owners are damaging the damaging nature, so to speak, with their improvised constructions or buildings. And that's the case that people saying, okay, this is like taken, this was not paid, and people are building and they are doing their necessities, they're they are doing their thing on the floor, and that kind of thing.
I think that's your point about the effect of people on, in quotes, nature, is an important one. And to claim that I have a right to nature, whatever that means, and if your presence on the piece of land outside my window is inflicting a penalty on me because you disrupted my nature, then the question is, well, how do you know it's my nature? You say, no, you don't know nature. You may own the dirt under your feet, but not the dirt across the way. And at that point, we get back to the state, because a friend an economist, Bobby McCormick, who passed away too soon, used to say to me, if I would complain about some noise or smell, he would say, can you call the sheriff? And that gets back to the state. If you're imposing a cost on me by moving into my nature space, can I call the sheriff and say, somebody just moved into my nature space? The sheriff's going to say, well, do you own the land? That's back to homesteading. And I can say, well, I was here first. And that may be a good rule, and the sheriff might come out and move you off. If I don't own the land, the sheriff's likely to say, well, what is it that you own? And if I say, well, I own a view, I get to look out at trees with nobody in them, and the sheriff would say, I don't think you own that. And if you do think you own it, then you're going to have to defend it yourself. It all comes back, in my mind, and it won't surprise you if you've read some of my work, it all comes back to how property rights are defined and how they're enforced. And that's really what the state is all about. It's about what the property rights are and how they're enforced or not enforced. And when people tell me there's a hate the word, I don't use it very often, but tell me there's an externality. That is, you are imposing a cost on me. Then I always now follow what Bobby told me. Can you call the sheriff? If the answer is no, then I don't have a right to be free of that supposed cost. So I think that's really kind of focused my idea of what the state is about. It's about whether the sheriff, the state, can be called upon to resolve these conflicts over how we use the world that we have around us.
And to end up in a high note and not in a bittersweet note, you met Milton Friedman and you met Hayek. Can you share like an anecdote that that you still remember and you recall, like not every day but now and then, of both?
My favorite one is from Milton Friedman. I use it often in lectures, especially introductory economics lectures. I was asked to speak at a birthday celebration that the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank was doing for Milton when he was probably 75 or 80. And I got into the elevator, and who was there but Milton? And I'd met him before, but I certainly wouldn't have expected him to know me. And I said, "Oh, Professor Friedman, it's great to see you." And I said, "I'm Terry Anderson." He said, "Oh yeah, I remember we met." And we chit-chatted a little bit. And then I asked him, "How's Rose?" Rose is his wife. And Milton said to me, when I said, "How's Rose?" he said, "Compared to what?" He was always thinking about the trade-offs, and that gets back to the property rights. What are the trade-offs? Using that piece of land for me to grow corn or you to raise cows, those are the trade-offs. So it's always compared to what, and I just have worshipped that short interaction with Milton.
Well, that's a really great anecdote, and yes, we use that in Argentina. Yes, compared to what, comparado con qué, it will be. Okay, so thank you, Terry. Yes, I got my throat with a seed of sesamus, so that was that can happen. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and for anyone that is seeing this, remember to subscribe to our channel and remember to support us, because even if our subscribers don't support me at all, I will continue doing this, so I don't care. But anyway, support us. So Terry, thank you very much. Let's stay in contact, and I'll wait for that article that you're
Okay,
writing.
I will send it. And to you and to all your listeners, stay well, but importantly, stay free.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye bye.